Say what you will about Netflix. Haruhi knows I have. But it's hard to argue they haven't been giving anime enjoyers our subscriptions worth. At least not in the last few years since Netflix jail was officially closed. Many of the best original anime and most ambitious visionary adaptations in recent memory are only able to exist at all with their variable lengths and release it when it's done levels of quality thanks to the flexibility afforded by Netflix's streaming model. Not to mention the many non-regional sparkling cartoons like Castlevania and Arcane that nonetheless scratch that old anime itch perfectly. Sure, not every production pans out. We all saw Record of Ragnarok and all wish we hadn't, and the less said about Cowboy Bebop's great new soundtrack, the better. But overall, their hit rate's been pretty dang good, and in the last few months especially, they've been feeding us so much good f***ing food, I'm starting to feel like Rentaro at the end of the 100 Girlfriends OP. And the cherry on top, which is in fact not a cherry at all, but rather an entire dimensionally compressed second cake disguised as a cherry, is Scott Pilgrim Takes Off.
Mystical powers? Unfair.
All's fair in love and...
War? I think it's war.
Back in the late 2000s, the idea of a Scott Pilgrim anime was this enticing yet impossible dream for basically every fan of the comics. But somehow, 13 years later, that dream has come true. And somehow, it's even better than we imagined. An experimental Sakuga smorgasbord on the level of Fooly Cooly, paired with a brilliant reimagining of the original story that, well, I just threw up a review on the second channel if you want to hear me gush about that. Because this video isn't really about the Scott Pilgrim anime. It's about that phrase I just said. The Scott Pilgrim anime, and the power it apparently has to resurrect one of the oldest and tiredest anime community arguments in its brain-deadest form yet. As part of a wider backlash against Netflix slapping the anime label on non-Japanese shows like Studio Mir's Devil May Cry and Powerhouse Animation's Tomb Raider, MyAnimeList has categorically refused to include Scott Pilgrim Takes Off in their database. And in doing so, they've made two fatal mistakes. First, ceding unnecessary territory to the objectively superior Annie chart, and second, exposing the blatant inconsistency of their own half-formed logic. So while Scott Pilgrim may have reanimated this abomination of an argument, it's also poised to be the final nail in its coffin. And this video is the hammer. Over the next 15-ish minutes, I intend to prove definitively that there is no workable definition of anime that does not include this anime. This is Scott Pilgrim versus MyAnimeList, brought to you by Bokksu. Hey, have you ever heard of Bokksu, the Japanese snack box service that sends authentic Japanese snacks straight to your door?
Oh, yeah, I actually deliver for them.
Well, did you know they work directly with family businesses all over Japan? So every time you enjoy a delicious snack like their handmade yuzu sake candy or their sumptuous sudachi citrus seaweed tempura, you're supporting traditional local artisans?
Yeah, dude, I just said I work for them.
But that's not the only great thing about Bokksu. They also include these cool little guidebooks in every gift box explaining the cultural context of all the candy in there. So it's like taking a little tour of Japan with your taste buds every time you tuck in. All of this makes Bokksu the perfect gift to give your friends and loved ones this holiday season, combining all the benefits of snacks with the power of knowledge. So what are you waiting for? If you want to give or enjoy the gift of authentic, delicious Japanese culture, click the link in the doobly-doo and use code BASEMENT for $15 off your new Bokksu order today!
It's the early 2000s. I don't know what a doobly-doo is.
Now, in the past, I have famously argued that, well, okay, is 1 million views really famous? Anyway, I have argued with at least some degree of notoriety before that even mostly Western productions like Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Boondocks that aim to capture the spirit of anime should be counted as anime. And I'll probably do it again when King of the Hill comes back, because, I mean, I just think it's fun. I like thinking about those weird edge cases. But that's not what we're here to do today. I would very much enjoy taking a more philosophical route in this discussion, pointing to the absolutely banging J-Rock OP with all them anime references, the sumptuous Sakuga in every last fight, the stylish use of canned animations, the incredible detail with which they've animated this Yuri makeout sesh, and ask you all, is this not anime? And no doubt that last sentence alone did just convince at least some of you who were on the fence, especially that bit with two chicks making out. If that's not anime, I don't know what is. But getting just a few folks off a fence simply isn't good enough when the fence itself simply does not deserve to exist. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off isn't some crazy structural radical anime edge case like King of the Hill, or even something in the murky middle ground like Avatar, Link Click, or Lookism. Scott Pilgrim was made in Japan at a Japanese-owned animation studio, and quite the studio at that. Science Saru are the leading pioneers in the anime industry for blending traditional and digital 2D animation techniques. This is not a matter of serious debate where both sides have valid points. You either agree this show is anime, or you don't know what you're talking about. Though, to be fair to the many anime fans out there who don't know what they're talking about, it is pretty hard to know if you're not talking about it in Japanese. Most information about how anime gets made and who makes it is only available in English as part of a secondary source, if it's available at all. Heck, sometimes you gotta go to a different website just to read the credits for whatever simulcast you were just watching. Information on this industry is something most of us have to seek out for ourselves, parsing conflicting, incomplete, or otherwise poor translations just to piece together a fuzzy picture of how shit really works. And you have to wade through a sea of anime fans talking out their asses about absolutely everything just to get to that point, which just isn't worth the effort unless this is like your job. But conveniently for all of us gathered here today, it is my job. So in the interest of making sure we all know what we're talking about on this specific subject, let's define some terms. When it comes to the question of what is anime, there are four fundamental categories of cartoon that we need to consider. On the least debatable ends of the spectrum, there's shows and films made in Japan for the Japanese market, and shows made for foreign markets in every country but Japan, which can technically be further subdivided into work produced primarily in the West and work outsourced to countries like China and Korea specifically that also function as satellite arms of the anime industry. But those divisions are only really useful for arguing cases like Avatar, which again, we're not here to do. There's also the question of French animation, which has deep ties to anime, but that's a whole other rabbit hole full of worm cans. Generally speaking, everyone who knows what they're talking about agrees that basically everything in this category is anime, at least everything released after Astro Boy, and almost everything in this one isn't. But shit starts to get really messy as we move into the space between them. In the middle of this little spectrum, we find international co-productions. That is, shows made with a mix of money and talent from Japan and some other country. The question of how much was contributed by the Japanese side in any given production lies at the heart of this issue. In defining the limits of anime, the Western fandom has drawn a line in the sand between true co-productions and outsourced cartoons. That is, shows where the Japanese staff had equal or greater creative pull compared to their foreign partners, versus shows where the Japanese animators were just following orders from the foreign team, like Tiny Toon Adventures, Thundercats, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and X-Men, all of which were produced at TMS, or Transformers, which was made over at Toei. Though even in those seemingly clear-cut examples, we find strange exceptions. The original Transformers series isn't listed on MAL, despite being based on a Japanese toy line, but they do count Transformers Scramble City, a semi-canonical OVA made for fans of the Japanese dub of Transformers, which stars all the same characters from the same cartoon, and was made by most of the same animators using the same animation techniques. So Transformers isn't anime, not even the Sakuga-packed movie, except for this one little 23-minute chunk that is. Same goes for TMNT and Mutantotatos Chojin Densetsuhen. But while those distinctions do seem silly and arbitrary, there is still logic behind them. Western anime fans in particular come to anime mostly to get away from American-style animated toy commercials, specifically like Transformers, He-Man, and TMNT. So if you're putting together a database of anime to help anime fans find more anime to watch, putting those shows in there is arguably a waste of storage space. I say arguably because there are some serious academic merits to including these works. Transformers in particular was a big moment in the history of Toei as a company, and serves as a prime example of cross-cultural influence between Japan and America. Like, it was a huge multi-year directing gig for Tokyo Animation Award Festival Lifetime Achievement winner Kozo Moroshita, but I mean, I guess that guy only directed Saint Seiya and produced Dragon Ball Z, so it's not like he's that important to the history of anime. Okay, I'll drop the sarcasm. Clearly, I fall on the side of this debate that thinks excluding only some co-productions causes more problems than it solves, but I do still think it's a debate worth having, and there are also very good arguments for excluding Transformers from sites like MAL, the most compelling one being that the Japanese dub was made 2 years after the English one, and thus the Japanese market was clearly a secondary concern for the show's producers, unlike the OVA, which was made for that market. It's a reasonable, logical place to draw a line, but if that's where MyAnimeList's line is, well, Scott Pilgrim launched with a fairly star-studded Japanese dub, so what the f***? MyAnimeList's mods have actually tried to answer that question, to be fair, but to be balanced, their answer f***ing sucks. In accordance with our guidelines, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off will not be added to the anime database. Despite the involvement of some Japanese industry talent, joint productions that aren't equally created for both markets are not eligible. In essence, their argument is that even though Scott Pilgrim was clearly made with the intent of reaching a Japanese audience on release, it just didn't try hard enough. Like, sure, it's got a Japanese dub, sure, it's being actively promoted on Netflix's Japanese social accounts, but most of the press articles about the series aren't in Japanese, which, you'll note, isn't something the Netflix marketing team can actually directly control, and because of that, it doesn't count as anime. This is obviously bullshit. Afro Samurai's in their database, and that was a Samuel L. Jackson vanity project, fully produced, cast, and distributed by Funimation, even in Japan. The Big O's in their database, and that show's producer, Keiichi Sato, told Anime Play in an interview that they planned on the series flopping in Japan, but being a hit in North America. The Adult Swim audience is literally the only reason the last 13 episodes of that show exist. But of course, MAL can't just pretend a Sunrise original series written by Chiaki J. Konaka isn't anime. Everyone would call bullshit on that, because it is bullshit. Trying to equivocate how equally a production is aimed at two different markets is simply bullshit, because there's no way to measure that. No one can read the production staff's minds to gauge their intent directly, and equating the success of a marketing campaign in a given region to how much effort actually went into that campaign is just stupid. That's not how the world works. Now, personally, I don't think that target market should matter at all in this discussion, and clearly neither do any of the MAL mods who keep listing entirely Chinese and Korean shows in the database. But if you do think that's an important factor, the only meaningful, objective way to measure that factor is whether the anime was produced alongside a Japanese dub. And Scott Pilgrim was. End of discussion. Well, I wish I could say that, but even if we take out every part of MAL's statement that's obvious bullshit, that does still leave us with one almost half sentence of semi-coherent defense for their position, and I did promise to prove that it was utterly indefensible, so I guess we gotta talk about that next. The defense in question is the phrase, despite the involvement of some Japanese industry talent, which quite obnoxiously implies that even had Scott Pilgrim been marketed at Japan hard enough, the production was still guided by too much Western influence to really count. And this is an argument with quite a bit of valid precedent behind it, actually. For example, the Rankin Bass films produced at Topcraft, the studio that would eventually become Ghibli, aren't considered anime because they were both written and directed by English-speaking people on the production. And I think that's fair. You can maybe argue that The Last Unicorn is anime, but The Hobbit definitely isn't. And while these early Topcraft productions are a worthy footnote in Studio Ghibli's history, it's hard to argue that they had a real lasting influence on anime beyond helping the staff that made Nausicaa hone their skills. If you think it's important to distinguish between true co-productions and outsourcing for anime, then looking at how much Japanese staff worked on a given project, especially in leading creative positions like screenwriter or director, is a fair and fairly easy measure of any given title's anime-ness. Cyberpunk Edgerunner's original story concept was written by the series' Polish producer, Rafał Jaki, and the show was clearly aimed mainly at a Western audience like the game, but that story was turned into a screenplay by Japanese writers at Trigger, and the show itself was directed by Imaishi himself, so obviously that's anime. For a more contentious example, Cyber 6, this totally badass Canadian co-production based on an equally badass Argentinian indie comic, seems to have been written almost entirely by staff on the Canadian side, but with Toshihiko Masuda directing, that still totally counts as anime, at least according to MAL. Oban Star Racers had a French writer and French series directors, but the composer, staff, and most of the episode directors were Japanese, so even that gets an MAL entry. Though, like I said, France is kind of its whole own bottomless wormhole in this discussion, so I don't really want to get into how much precedent that actually sets. There are other outliers like Tech on Kincrete, but generally speaking, the line that MAL seems to have drawn on this issue is that either the writer or the director of a film or show needs to be Japanese industry talent for it to count. So The Last Unicorn doesn't, but Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, an adaptation of an American comic created with the explicit purpose of helping Tokyo Movie Shinsha break into the American market, does. That movie's on MAL, so that's where we're gonna say the line is. If Scott Pilgrim falls on the Japanese side of that line, it is anime by literally every reasonable standard. And indeed, if we look at the series credits on Wikipedia, we find that while the writing is credited to Brian Lee O'Malley and Ben David Grabinski, the director was Abel Gongora? That doesn't sound Japanese. Shoot, I guess this whole video's invalid. Boy, that sure is some egg on my face, especially after how confident I was. I might even go Luigi myself over this, but I guess before I do, I should probably go, click his name just to make sure. Okay, let's see. Spanish animator, that's not good. Japanese animation studio Science Saru, okay. One of its earliest employees. Sure sounds like Japanese industry talent to me. I mean, he's lived there for a decade and a half now. He worked on Ping Pong, Crayon Shin-Chan, Yokai Watch, Devilman. He's clearly put in the hours to earn his stripes in the industry, and oh, hey, look, he's even got his own page on MAL and on Anime News Network, where we can also look at the complete list of Scott Pilgrim's staff to confirm that every episode director, animation director, art director, sound production manager, storyboarder, character designer, key animator, in-betweener, color setter, compositor, painter, paint checker, paint check assistant, and background artist on the show is also Japanese industry talent, plus a bunch of other roles. So, yeah, however you want to define anime, Scott Pilgrim takes off is anime. I'd say f you fight me, but omae wa mou shinderu. Which leaves just one last important question. Why does any of this matter? In most ways, it doesn't. Back when the Western anime community was organized around a general distaste for tropes and aesthetics of American animation, sure, drawing these lines was useful. But nowadays, with shows like Arcane, Blue Eye Samurai, Pantheon, Scavenger's Reign, and Venture Bros pushing the boundaries for mature cinematic storytelling and cartoons, and even shows for younger audiences like Infinity Train, Owl House, or Steven Universe blending Eastern and Western principles of storytelling and animation, these lines mostly just get in the way. Anime lovers should be celebrating whenever a show as beautiful and wonderful as Scott Pilgrim Takes Off comes out, regardless of where it comes from. And there shouldn't be any division between us celebrating that sort of thing and the cartoon fandom doing the same. To paraphrase some very wise words from Bart Simpson, it's all animation, people. We all want to see this medium get pushed to new heights and all the brilliant artists who create it get the cultural recognition they deserve, and I think animation fans would have a much easier time making that happen if we acted like a single community instead of drawing these console war level arbitrary battle lines between us. Like, I get it. Drawn Together was a war crime against anime, but at some point we have to forgive and forget. But then, of course, that's not the only obstacle here, is it? There are people in this community who actively oppose making the tent big enough to accommodate all the great animation out there. And this effort to gatekeep the definition of anime is one of the key tools that helps them do that. As long as there's a visible portion of this community whose reaction to something like Scott Pilgrim is CalArts Beanmouth, anime Janai! It's gonna stay an inherently hostile space to discussions of Utena references and Steven Universe, or that excellent Simpsons Death Note parody, and a lot of other things. But it doesn't have to be that way, because we don't have to let these people be part of our community. This whole Scott Pilgrim debacle clearly demonstrates they don't have any kind of consistent, logical basis for their extremely aggressive points of view. They just have knee-jerk reactions, then move the goalposts wherever they need to be to justify those reactions. And people who act like that, people who respond to being called out for lying by throwing out mindless insults, will never stop causing problems and starting arguments in this community. And the only way to mitigate that is to simply refuse to engage with them on the basis that they are fundamentally unserious, self-evidently dishonest people who often have literally nothing of value to add to the arguments they insist on having. It shouldn't matter whether or not Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is anime, but regardless, it is, by any valid definition of the word. And if you're gonna insist on drawing a line around it and saying everyone on the wrong side of it isn't a real anime fan, great, you're officially on the wrong side. Get out of here and let the rest of us enjoy our anime in peace. I'm Geoff Thew, professional anime identifier, and if you'll excuse me, I've gotta go stare ponderously at Lunatics Unleashed.